Is that what you can see? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these questions. There's only, was it 7, 9, some nice number like that, right? And basically we can do these together, and that's not the problem. I just want to add stuff to it. I guess one of the things that WebAssign doesn't allow us to do is kind of like written responses, which you could do normal homework, where you could just write sentences about more detail of what you've got. Because in all of these questions, you just have 2 choices and then you pick it. So although I'm going to be doing the answer, I want to try and get more out of it than just say it's that guy and move on. So here's our first story. In this situation, indicate whether you think an observational study or a randomized experiment would be the best to do. So this is a social psychologist wants to determine whether restaurant servers get better tips if they introduce themselves by name to the people they serve. So I guess, you know, if you go into a restaurant, it seems to me, and I'm just doing this from memory, that almost everybody says, "Hi, my name is Janice. I'm going to be, you know, whatever," right? So that's, maybe this is the reason someone found out you get more tips. So do you think they could get information on whether introducing yourself, if you're a waiter, waitress, whatever, a restaurant server, good, they've got a better name for it. If you're a restaurant server, whether giving your name gets you more tips than not. How do you think that would work? Observational or randomized? What do you think would get you the best data to say, yeah, that's true, or no, it's not?
Observational.
Absolutely.
We could certainly do it observational, but the question I'm kind of the way I'm phrasing is, what would get you the best data, the best information? You remember at the end of yesterday, I gave a hierarchy of this is best and this is worse. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. You could do it observational, but I think you could do it better if you did it as what they're calling a randomized experiment. I mean, the minute somebody says experiment, I'm assuming that it's randomized as part of the process. So maybe that word distracted you. So there's 2 correct answers here, because Lauren's not wrong. If you click the wrong one, according to WebAssign, you'll know it and you'll pick the other one. So let me go into the details of both techniques. Here's observation. This is one way of doing it, not the only way of doing it. You go to the restaurant and you watch waitresses or waiters, restaurant service, great. You watch restaurant service. And Janice always introduces herself to the people and Robert never does. And you, at the end of the day, you find out how many tips they own, right? So you can imagine you did that with lots and lots of different people. And the answer that you got was that people who introduced themselves got about 10% more tips than the people who didn't, right? You see, that would be observational. Why? Well, aren't you just observing what people did and writing down, this person says their name, this other person doesn't, and the information that you collected was how many tips they got? Agreed? That would be an observational way. Now, is that the only way? No, there are tons of ways you could do it. That's just what came into my head. Now, if I wanted to do it as this randomized experiment, which is actually what WebAssign says is the right answer, but I think observational is good, you know, so who knows why it picked that one. But if I wanted to do it as randomized, I could. What I'd have to do is, it'd have to be a big restaurant so I could get lots of data. Let's say there's 100 people working at this restaurant, right? It'd be a massive big one, right? Couldn't I split them into 2 groups randomly? And we say to the first group, just for today, introduce yourself when you serve your customers. And they say to the other group, I know you might normally do it, but don't introduce yourself, right? Just do everything else, but don't introduce yourself. Now, in that case there, since the only thing that's different between the 2 groups is whether they introduce themselves or not, when you collected the data about tips, that would be much better information. because isn't the only difference between the two groups, because they're all pretty random, right? There's people who do a good job and people who do a so-so job in both groups, right? Anything that's different could only have been they introduced themselves. If you did the observational one, couldn't it be, just for argument's sake, couldn't there be one of those lurking variables? Maybe servers who introduce themselves are also the kind of people who typically meet the needs of their customers more, right? They're always asking, do you need extra Coke? What do you need? How's the meal going? And the other ones who don't introduce themselves, maybe they're not really into the job, and so they might not do such a good job. Could you see that the name thing might not be the important feature? Couldn't it just be that's just another reflection on someone who does a good job compared to someone who does maybe not such a good job? Does that kind of make sense? The kind of the scenario I'm putting behind this, right? Now, all you get to do in the homework is pick one of the two, and whatever one's right is right, I guess. Okay, question 2 now. In each situation, explain the explanatory variable and the response. Okay. Now, explanatory variable is the thing that you use to ask the question, and the response is the answer to that question. So a teacher wants to compare the GPA of students who are in sororities to the GPA of average students who are not in the sororities. Right. Now, grade point average is the explanatory variable, and whether or not the student is a sorority. So you go and you say, Jimmy, what's your GPA? 3.9. Are you in a sorority? No. X-axis, the GPA, Y-axis, I guess, sorority or not, that'd be 0 and 1. Okay, B, a doctor wants to compare the effectiveness of 2 allergy medications. Which one of those, the first or the second dot, is the answer? They want to compare the effectiveness of 2 allergy medications. I see your finger up on 1. Does that seem reasonable? I like it. A social psychologist wants to determine whether restaurants get better tips. Oh, come on, I've seen that question. I'm not doing that one again. Okay. A child psychologist wants to find out whether there is an association between the amount of television a 6-year-old children watches and how often they bully other children in school. Which one of those is the explanatory and which one's the response? The first or the second? A hesitant one. Okay. Looks for clues here. Very often the order in which the sentence is said. Aren't you interested in, do they bully people at school? So that's the response. Are they bullies or not? What are you comparing that against? Oh, how many hours of TV they watch, right? Now, it could be that there is no relationship at all. Could you imagine 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they have bullying incidents, right? I don't know, in a half hour, how many times do they do something that would be considered a bullying offence? I don't know if there'd be any connection there. Well, on to 3 then. Suppose that a statistics teacher wants to know whether the number of hours spent studying in a group affects the final course grade. In each part, explain whether the research method is an experiment or an observational study. Okay, so students keep a log of the hours they spent studying in a group, and they report the total number of hours after the course is completed. What would you consider that?
Observational study.
I would agree. Would you agree it's observation? Right. Now there's 5 choices in there, so you just go through each one until you get the one. So let's look for one they observe. This is observation because the teacher observes student behavior after assigning students to different groups, but students do not assign randomly. Okay, that seems pretty good. Now, the minute you put students into groups and then you collect other information, can you see that it's now more organized, more structured? And so when you see something like that, you may want to look at the randomized experiment. And the last one, we'll let you do that last one. Right, on to question 4. Suppose that an observational study shows that students who got at least 7 hours of sleep perform better on exams than students who didn't. So it's an observational study, right? So I guess they collected data by just saying to students, how many hours did you study and what did you get in the exam, right? How many hours did you sleep, I should say, and what did you get in the exam? Now, I could imagine that might be true, but there are possible confounding variables. Confounding variables, just another name for lurking variable. And we're going to look at which of the following are possible confounding variables and which are not, and then try and explain in each case. The number of courses that the student took. Could this be a confounding variable? Agreed. Would you agree that if you take 1 class, you're probably going to do better than if you do 5 classes? Have you all tried that sometime and say, I'm never, ever doing that again, right? You all know that it doesn't work well, right? So that would definitely, I would say yes for that one. And then you've got a sense about why that would be the case. Do you think the weight of the student is probably going to have any effect? Doing a dumble down? So I would say no. This one I have to think about. I'm not sure myself. The number of hours a student spent partying in a typical week. Yeah, okay. I mean, if you overdo it, I think that's going to have an effect. And that might be the reason why they don't sleep so much, right? I guess that's it, right? So pick one of them that says something along those lines. Right, here is the next one. So for each of these studies, describe or explain whether it's observational or randomized. I'm just going to do the first part of each. A group of 100 students was randomly divided. I'm stop looking. I know the answer. I don't even need to read the rest of the story, would you agree? What was the clue? Not
Word randomly.
Yeah. So you just need to go straight into that fella, right? If you know the key word, isn't it sometimes easy to tell? Sometimes they're a little bit sneaky, right? And you have to read into, right? A random sample of patients who received a hip transplant, so be careful, at some university during a 10-year period were followed for another 10 years after their operation to determine the success or failure of that transplant. Now, I know it used the word random sample, but they're being sneaky here.
It would be observational because they're having an operation.
Yeah, and they're just watching what happened. The random sample is, we don't have enough money to follow every single person as a hip operation, so we only pick some of you. So you got to be careful with observational ones, because sometimes you're observing, but you only pick some people to observe. It's still observational, right? And the top one, if you let, when it said randomly divided, that was the key, not just the random, but the divided. Now, what about C? Volunteers with high blood pressure were randomly divided into 2 groups One was taught to practice meditation and the other was given a low-fat diet, and then after 8 weeks, they figured out what their blood pressure was. What would that be?
Technically, it's actually a random observational, but it is randomized.
It is randomized, so we'll go for randomized. Move on, question 6. The search scenario part A and B explain whether Ramandes could be used. Okay. In question A, get my answers that they have here. Explain whether a randomized experiment could be used to study the relationship between long-term practice of meditation and blood pressure. Is it possible to do that? So you think there might be a relationship that if you do meditation, you can have your blood pressure go down, right? I guess that's what you're trying to collect data on. Could you organize that as a random experiment?
I feel like it'd be more of an observational experiment.
It would be easier to do that way. I totally agree. But is it possible? Not that you might choose not to do it, but it is possible actually.
It is possible.
Yeah.
To do it.
Right. So let's figure out how you could do it. Couldn't you get 1,000 volunteers? You need volunteers for things, right? Because you can't pick people and make them do anything, right? That's illegal. So you get 1,000 volunteers and you pay them money because you have to do that as well, or nobody does anything, right? So you get 1,000 volunteers and you randomly split them into 2 groups. And you take the blood pressure of them, right? And one group, you teach them, if that's the right word, to meditate. And you ask them to do it, half an hour every day. And the second group, you just say, well, thank you for volunteering. Just do what you're going to do anyway. And then measure their blood pressures like a year later. Now, since both groups are very random, would you agree the only thing that's different is meditation, right? Because they'll still be as unhealthy as they've always been, or they'll still be joggers and marathon runners if that's what they were. Isn't the only difference is one group is meditating, the other doesn't. And so you look at the blood pressures. And if you've got a difference, that would mean meditating does work. And if there was no real difference between the 2 groups, you would say it didn't. Now, the reason why you might not want to do observational is, can you imagine that people who do meditation might be different from people who don't? So I'll make this up. Couldn't people who do meditation be kind of cool dudes who just chill out and don't stress over nothing? And meditation is part of their life thing and they don't really get too uptight. Wouldn't those people probably have lower blood pressure than other people who don't do that? And the minute you've got a lurking variable like lifestyle, which is kind of what that is, you see it's hard to separate the meditation as why it's happening. So you try and avoid observational. Sometimes you can't help it, but you try. B, explain whether a randomized experiment could be used to determine whether a special training program improves scores on, like SATs and things. Could that be done as a randomized experiment? Is there a way that that could happen?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do my 1,000 volunteer thing, randomly put them into 2 groups. One group gets this new college preparation course, the other don't. And then you see what the scores are like, right? They'll be different, but won't the average be better in one than the other if this new course does any good, right? This new preparation course does any good. True story. It's vaguely connected to this. There was, back in Scotland, quite a long time ago when I was a child. So we're talking 60 years, 50, 60 years ago. when you went to school, you got this thing called free milk. What they gave you is it was like a wax carton. It's about, I don't know, a third of a pint. And they gave it to you. And they did that because they were concerned about children not getting enough nourishment, not getting enough calcium, and milk was considered a good source of it. And you got free milk. And the reason that they introduced it, I think they probably stopped it now, but I'm not 100% sure, is they introduced it is that they did an experiment. And what they did is that they did randomized experiment where they took children and some got the milk and some didn't. And then they were going to use that data to decide whether or not there was any improvement over the year, whether the children that got milk were at least average weight instead of being underweight and so on and so forth. So you got to think of countries, I know it's hard to think of maybe in America, but you got to think that not all the countries in the world are like America. And certainly the area I lived in was extremely poor. So it wasn't that uncommon for children not to be as well fed as they should be. Bottom line was that the experiment was an absolute disaster. And the reason why it was an absolute disaster is because they didn't structure it well. It was on paper structured totally well. They had a class full of 30 kids and you were randomly assigned 15 of those kids were going to get milk and the other 15 weren't going to get milk, right? Now, when the teacher was doing that, she got a list of the kids who had to get milk. And you know, the teacher also knew who was the poor kids in class and who came from, classes that, came from families that could afford it, right? And can you imagine what she'd done when she found out that Mary, who had plenty to eat and was probably got more food than she needed, was assigned to get the milk. And Jimmy, who came to school sometimes, you could tell this kid hadn't ate for a day, got nothing. Do you know what she did? She gave him the milk. She didn't follow the rules. And so you were allegedly you were assigning it to certain people, but who actually got it was that the teachers just said, oh, the heck with that. I'm giving the 15 in the class who need it and the other one don't need it anyway. So that screwed up the data. But being good government, they ignored the fact that it didn't work and they still did it. So go figure. True story. Should read about it. Do they do that in America? Do you get free milk?
No.
Have you ever heard of that?
Yes.
Oh.
It depends on the school. Some of them, they'll give you free milk, some of them don't.
Is that a school depending on if it's a poorer area or a richer area, maybe?
I don't think so. I think it's just how lenient they are with their milk, I guess. Because my school did it, but when I went to high school, they didn't do it.
Yeah, we don't do it in high school either. It was only for the kids. It's only up to 11 that we did it for.
It was a subsidized food program.
Is that what you called it in America? Now, was food milk or milk and stuff?
Milk and stuff, because when I was a child, even up to high school, to some extent, you got a little stub that you could turn in for a nutritious, quote unquote, meal. Usually it was the cheapest stuff, not necessarily the best stuff.
So it sounds like America did something similar, but maybe not as rigorous as we did in Scotland.
My high school was a little more nicer, and they just because they based every student off a code. So if your code was marked for free lunch, then they just gave it to you. So whatever they served, you got it.
Yeah, that was nice of them. So I learn things every day. Okay, we're moving on to see part A, the state the explanatory and response. Nah, that can do. I like that. You can write down stuff. Moving on to 7. For this research scenario in part A and B, explain whether another randomized could be done. Okay, so this one a little bit more detail. To compare two programs to reduce the number of commuters who drive to work, providing discount coupons for the bus, or providing shuttle service for people who need to run errands during the workday. Figure that out. Sorry, explain whether it could be used to compare two programs to reduce the number of commuters who drive to work. Okay, so you want to stop people from driving to work, and so they have a discount coupon for the bus. So you give them tickets and it makes the bus half price or something, I guess, right? The fare's half price. And the other one is a shuttle service for people who need to run errands during the workday. I have no idea what that means. A shuttle service for people. Does that mean a bus and you can just go down and say, take me to Safeway, and they take you Safeway and you come back?
Free taxi.
Okay, it's
Kind of like Uber or Lyft, essentially. How somebody comes to your house, picks you up, takes you where you need to go, and then drops you off.
okay. So I guess the question, I'm not going to go into details of it because I don't feel comfortable about the storyline, but you could do a randomized experiment in that. Wouldn't you just take people who work in your company and randomly assign half of them to get the bus pass and the other half to get access to the taxi service? And then just see how many of them don't use their car. Because some of them might say, well, thanks for the coupon, but I'm still driving. And others might think, yeah, driving's murder. I might as well just use the bus. I can have a half-hour sleep on the way in. Which is true. I've been on the ferry from Bremerton over to Seattle, and do you know the students who go to UW but live on the side? Do you know they use that ferry for doing their homework and having an extra snooze? So I guess it could work, couldn't it? Because the other alternate, if you didn't drive on the ferry, is you drive all the way around. And I don't think people would do that. So I guess it might work. What about B? Study the relationship between age and the opinion about whether marijuana should be legal. Could that be made randomized? Because I can't think of any way of that being randomized. Isn't that you just pick people and they tell you if they're in favor of it or not? Yeah, I don't see how that one could be done. No. So I'm going that it couldn't be done, so I'd pick that one. Can't really talk more except no, because what you're doing is you can't change the age of a person, right? And you can't really change whether they think marijuana should be legal, right? You don't really have much control over those. Aren't you just asking them and that's about it? I can't see anything else you could do. And explanatory response, I don't really want to do that. So, almost finished. There is a lot of stuff that we haven't, well, I don't know if I'd say covered, but there's a lot of different nuances that we haven't covered. And so when you do this homework, you are going to be probably hitting that button where you have to go to the section and read a little spiel about, remember I did Simpson's Paradox yesterday, and Lauren, you picked the right one, which is Hawthorne's. Remember that one? Now, you didn't know what Hawthorne was. Do you know if you reach that question, wouldn't you have to go and click on the thing and read a bit about this thing called Hawthorne and read this thing about Simpson's Paradox and say, oh, that story fits this one. And that's how you pick it.